Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning. Today my guest is Imogen Ragone, an Alexander Technique teacher and website designer in Wilmington, Delaware. And for this podcast, Imogen is going to interview me, and the topic is going to be my experiences and impressions of the late Marjorie Barstow, who was a well-known teacher of the Alexander technique, trained with Alexander on his first training course, the first person to graduate from it, and lived most of her life here in Lincoln, Nebraska. So, Imogen, welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you about this because I never had the fortune of meeting Marjorie Barstow, but have heard so much about her.
Well, thank you
So
for doing
maybe,
this. Yeah,
yeah.
carry on. Yeah.
So maybe we just start right at the beginning. Where were you in your life when you first kind of heard of Marjorie Barstow and met her for the first time?
I first heard of her after I'd been having lessons for a while, and I'd heard these vague rumors of someone out in Nebraska who was doing group work, and I was somewhat intrigued. Um, I then went. I did end up going to a training course in England, and about halfway through the training course, I came during winter break. I flew out to Lincoln to do a 2 week workshop
Hmm.
that she gave every winter. It was 14 days straight, no
Wow.
breaks, six, seven
Mm.
hours a day. It was pretty amazing. And I was just, it was really a transformative experience in many ways. Um, I could say some of those ways.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
can you describe that very first day when you went
yeah,
into the workshop and what happened and what was she like and what was different?
well, the workshop was held in the basement of the music school at the University of Nebraska. At that time, it was one of the few buildings that was heated over winter break.
Well, that's good.
And she had a student who was on the faculty there, so we had access to that. We had access to a large room in the basement. And I remember going there the first morning before she arrived, and there were all of these uh, kind of molded chairs, the stackable molded
Hmm.
chairs lying around. And I thought to myself, well, when Marge gets here, she's not going to want to use these because they're not good Alexander seats. Um, that's just my first thought. But
Hmm.
Marge seemed not to be remotely interested in that. I think there were a few regular chairs. That didn't seem to concern her in the slightest. She came in. She was at that time, uh, I think, 79 or possibly 80 years old.
Okay.
She, visually, I mean, her face did look very old, but otherwise, she looked like a 35-year-old woman. I mean, if you were
Hmm.
to see her walking down the street, say from behind, you would think it was a young woman, or
Hmm.
not super young, but
Sure.
she moved very gracefully and easily. And the other assumption that I made was I guess there were about 25 people in this group,
Hmm.
some of whom had studied with her in the past. There were some new people there. I assumed that with that number of people, she's going to be really busy coming around putting her hands on people as much as possible
Hmm.
because just the sheer numbers, right? This is
Uh-huh.
all based on my earlier experience with lessons and being on a training course in London. But in fact, she used her hands not a whole lot during the first morning. I mean, everyone got a little bit of
So
hands-on help.
how did she structure? What was the structure of this first workshop
The
that you or this day?
yeah the
Yeah.
first morning of this 14-day workshop.
Yeah.
Um, and
Can
when
you
I say
remember?
14 days, I mean weekends, New Year's Day, everything was all included. Um, the way she structured it was she would say a few words. I don't remember exactly what she said, and then she would come around to everyone as they were sitting and work with them a little bit, mainly around with her hands on their necks or shoulders.
Hmm.
And she was right from the start, she was asking people what they noticed in themselves and what they noticed in other people. So she immediately turned, she had people in a circular type arrangement, and she was right away interested in waking up people's visual and sensory appreciation. That was something that was quite evident from the beginning. The quality of her hands was truly amazing. I had never experienced anything like that before from anybody. Was clearly in a different universe from anything I'd encountered in England or in Canada before that.
Before and since?
Pretty much, yeah,
Wow.
yep. I mean, well, some of her students have that same quality as well, but it was just an incredibly light but precise touch.
Hmm.
And yeah, I could sense. It was one of the few occasions where I could actually sense a change in myself. I generally was not very sensitive to changes during any sort of Alexander lesson, but I could feel that there. Yeah, wow, I did notice something. And then she would ask. She would basically say, "Well, who wants to do something like who has an activity they'd like to work with?" And a lot of the time was spent with people getting up and doing various things, singing, speaking, playing a musical instrument. We spent a lot of time with walking, sometimes groups of people walking, and all the while she was being very clear that she wanted everyone to notice what was going on, even if they weren't sort of actively involved in the activity. That was a sort of a constant theme, and it was a constant theme from then on, throughout all her
So the
years.
people doing the activities were being worked with her in front of the group, and that's how
Yes,
she. And was that always a voluntary thing? People put themselves forward, or
yes, yes.
it wasn't that she went through each person in turn and.
She
Uh,
would.
uh,
The only time she did went to everyone is just as people were sitting. She
mhm.
would come around and work with everyone at the beginning, and then maybe then sometimes uh, as a little break, she would get people standing up and moving around, and she would give what she called quickies, which were people would sort of line up and she'd sort of zap them as they walked by her and off they'd go. And those could be very powerful and those were fascinating to watch as well. But no,
But so
she was very respectful of anyone who didn't feel comfortable getting up in front of the group. She was not going to
right.
be pushy about that at all. And there were a
That's
few people like that, brand new people who really had no idea what was going on and just felt a bit diffident about that.
sure, but also the onus was on you as a participant is if you wanted to get some work to put yourself forward, right?
Yes, I'd say so, but um, you could get a lot of benefit by just watching.
Right,
Yeah,
right. I meant
yeah.
specific personal on your activity. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
generally, I mean, there would be people who were a little bit shy about it at first, but certainly by the second or third day, uh, everyone was fine with doing something.
Hmm.
And it didn't have to be anything. She made it very clear that you didn't have to be a performer of any kind. If all you wanted to do was work with standing or walking or just anything, any activity that you would do. And people would sometimes come up with very creative activities like eating an apple or
Hmm.
I can't remember all the different things, but it just her emphasis always was on what are you actually doing in your life, and how can you use this work to do it better.
So what you described does sound quite different from what I might call a traditional Alexander technique lesson, especially I think your training course was the Carrington line, right?
Carrington line, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So I can imagine it was quite different.
It
Um,
was very different. It was very different. And there was
uh,
another difference that appeared very early on that took me a day or two to really digest, which is that her directions, her verbal directions, were, I would say, dramatically different from those that I had encountered in England,
hmm,
which at that time, the directions that I had been learning, and this is like, a year and a half there, uh, uh, generally something along the lines, I'm letting my neck be free, and then various things tacked onto it, or I'm
mhm,
freeing my neck. There was a lot of variation, and there was a lot of unclarity about it, in my
mhm,
opinion. I mean, different teachers had different expressions, and I would push people to explain what they meant, and I'd get all sorts of explanations about what they meant. Marge, there was always this emphasis on England in England that you weren't doing anything, right? You were
mhm,
just thinking. But Marge approached it a little differently. She had her sort of go-to directions were something along the lines of let your head release delicately away from your torso. And then she might tack on in such a way that your torso comes along with it, that sort of thing. And so she would talk in terms of movement, which
mhm,
was a big shock to me. But and I would question her. I remember the first day or two, every break I'd come up and say, "Well, but Marge, you're not supposed to move," you know. And eventually, the way I understood it was that the directions that I'd been getting were supposedly just mental thoughts, but of course, there's no such thing as a mental thought that doesn't have some physical
right.
correlate. And even someone like Patrick McDonald would say things like, well, yes, there is a teeny little movement there, you know.
Mhm,
And I think how Marge approached this interface between thought and movement was coming from the other direction, coming from the movement side, but emphasizing how little and how delicate it was. She used that word delicate a lot.
yes,
And
yeah.
I think that was the essential difference. And once I understood that, I started experimenting with that on my own. I remember taking long walks in the evenings uh, during that workshop and just experimenting with delicately moving my head away from my body. And wow, I could really sense something going on there and changes. And so it was really the first time ever that I had used a direction that I actually felt there was a direction I could use that had some effect.
Huh.
So it was very exciting for me because uh, it never really happened before.
Yeah, I might be getting a little sidetracked, but I'm just curious after that encounter, because I know then you went to many workshops and things over the years, but you then were going back to England to complete your training, and
Hmm.
I'm wondering how these two different approaches melded or did not for you as you
I
kind of
didn't have a problem.
good.
I actually went out twice during the last part of my training. I went
Oh,
out the
right.
following year too. And I do remember coming back to England and going into class the first day, and everything did seem kind of slow, you know. And I just made a note of that. It didn't bother me so much because I knew I was getting benefits from that as well.
Hmm.
But I knew by well before the end of that first workshop that she was ultimately going to be my main teacher. I had no thoughts of not going back to England and finishing up, because I enjoyed every minute of that as well.
Hmm.
But I just saw in her teaching something that I had not seen before, and for me at least seemed like, for me, a better a better approach to the technique. I will say that the direction she used, she never pushed them as being better than anyone else's directions. I
Right.
mean, she just said, "I've found these useful." That
Hmm.
was her approach. If someone wanted to talk in terms of my neck is free and my head's going forward and up, releasing whatever, she was fine with that. She had
Hmm.
no objection to it at all. She just felt that she had worked out something that worked better for her, and I believe for many of her students.
Hmm. So that was your first encounter, that workshop,
Yeah.
in the middle of your training, and then you said you went out again. Was that the following
The
winter?
following winter, and
Okay.
I convinced another person on the training course to come out with me. So
Uh-huh.
there were two of us out there,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and yeah, and I also told a number of people. I had to be a little cautious in who I talked to, because one of the directors of my training course would probably not have responded well. On the other hand, the other one of the Paul Collins, who was one of
Hmm.
the directors, he was fascinated because he was kind of a pioneer in the application approach in England. He would work with runners a lot. While he was running, he would teach them, and that was
Mm-hmm.
pretty far out in England at that time. So he was very interested, and I think if he had lived longer than he did, he might have ended up going out to visit Marge too. He was intrigued for sure.
So you finished your training in England.
Hmm.
What then happened with your kind of learning and studying with Marge? What did you do next?
Right. Well, Marge had every winter had these winter
Mhm.
workshops, and then every summer she had a month-long workshop, kind of a
Wow.
summer
Mhm.
camp thing.
Mhm.
It could be 100, 125 people there with her at any one time. So I started going to all of those. Also, she at that time in the early 80s, I moved back to Toronto. Another teacher in Toronto was bringing her there once or twice a year, so I got to go to those workshops as well. And then at one point, I started. She used to do a lot of traveling. She
Mhm.
was out of the city maybe half the time. She had sort of an East Coast tour and a
Mhm.
West Coast tour. And I latched on to one of those stops, which was in Seattle, and that was a good place to go.
Mhm.
So I would just go to workshops with her wherever I could,
So you
and
were a few times a
a
year?
few times a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've what I noticed was a couple of things. Her basic approach didn't change, but she did make certain. She did sort of adapt to changing, especially changing sizes of the people groups that came to her.
Mm.
Because at one point, like the summer workshops were getting huge, and
Mhm.
I remember thinking, how is she going to handle it? I mean, right now we've got 125 people, and she would have some of her students help, but that's a lot of people. What's going to happen if it gets to 500? You know, it was sort of heading in that direction.
Mhm.
And her solution was very interesting. It was to sort of speed things up. Like what would take her 2 or 3 or 4 days to kind of get to in the early workshops, she would get to in the first one. She just kind of moved people along more quickly. New people could still enter, but they really had to keep up a little more
Hmm.
than before. But it still worked. There were always new people.
So did she have assistant teachers, or was she always
She
doing it all
No,
herself?
for the summer workshops, she started having some of the people who were particularly people who were living in Lincoln, who had moved to Lincoln to study with her, and some of the people who studied with her a long time. She would have them assist her, and they would take there would be some dividing up into smaller groups, and they would work with some of the groups. So there was some delegation of teaching. Yes, absolutely.
So you obviously got to know her quite well personally,
I
not
did.
just.
Yeah.
So what was she like as a person?
She was, you know, she was a one of a kind lady. In some ways, she had this quality that, in some ways, if you were to just encounter her and you didn't know anything about the Alexander technique and you were just encountering her in some day to day situation, you would think, well, it's this nice little old lady, maybe a little boring, right? Uh, she didn't have a very active, as far as I could tell, a very active mental life outside of the Alexander technique and outside of managing her ranch and her business things, because she was her I should say that Marge's family, who had all pretty much died out
Mhm.
by the time I met her, except her one of her nephews, um, she was an extraordinarily wealthy individual. She inherited a lot from her father, and he owned all kinds of business ventures, grain elevators, and they had a ranch, and also he was the founder of one of the largest banks in Lincoln back in the early 19th century, 20th century. So she had all these kind of financial investments that she took an active role in managing even at an older age. And I didn't know much about the details of that, but I know periodically she'd say, "Oh, I've got to go down to a meeting at the bank and discuss this." Sometimes I drive her down there. But that was part of her life. Alexander technique, I would say, was an extremely large part of her life. And then
Mhm.
she had some other very prosaic interests. She was a member of the Lincoln Doll Club. She was a doll collector.
Oh wow.
Yeah, she had a whole room devoted to her dolls, and they were everywhere in the house. She lived in a very large house that her father built in 1901, and she basically lived in that house her entire life, except when she was, in England.
Mhm.
Um, so in some ways, she wasn't. There wasn't much you could talk to her about other than Alexander stuff. She didn't have much of an interest in other obvious conversational
Huh.
topics.
Now, wasn't she a dancer when she was
She
younger?
had been, yeah, she had a dance studio that she had built over the garage in her house,
Hmm.
which is still there. And yeah, she had been a dance instructor, and she she used to say sometime, because she discovered the Alexander technique in the early 20s. Her dance teacher gave her a copy of Constructive Conscious
Oh
Control,
right,
I
yeah.
believe. Yeah,
Wow.
and also an article that it was in an article about the technique that intrigued her. And in the 20s, she and her sister, her younger sister, I believe, or maybe her older sister, Helen, went on a 6 month trip to England to study with Alexander.
Right.
It's all video. They had the first. She had the first movie camera in Nebraska, and so she took pictures of everything. including Alexander, and they're on they're on a documentary you
Hmm.
can see on her website. And apparently told him when she left that if he ever started a training course to let her know because she wanted to be on it. And sure enough, in 19, I guess 31, he announced he was going to start a training course, and she was the first person to sign up, and off she went. Um,
Wow.
yeah,
Mhm.
um, yeah,
So, yeah. So, how, so you studied with her from that first workshop right through till the rest of her life, right?
well, yeah,
Uh,
because in 1990, so she was
mhm,
now 91 years old.
mhm.
She announced that she wasn't going to travel anymore, or not, travel very little. And I thought, oh, okay, she's going to be in England. She's going to be in Lincoln. I could move to Lincoln and run workshops for her here, which is what I did for about 3 years. We had several workshops a year,
Mhm.
and they were very successful. And in addition to going to those, and it was really
Mhm.
the reason why I organized them, was she also taught at her home two evenings a week, Mondays and Fridays, and anyone could show up, and sometimes anyone would. I mean, people would just drop in,
So,
and
just a group of where they've gathered.
yeah, people would just
Mhm.
show up around 5 o'clock and go to around 7. And sometimes people would just come in, friends, someone heard about it, would show up. It was a fascinating experience
Huh.
being at those. And when she got to the point where she really couldn't teach much anymore in groups, her sort of width of attention contracted, I'd say, in her early 90s. Um, then what would happen is she would work with one or possibly two people at a time, and you would essentially get these lengthy private sessions with her. And I got well over 100 of those over the course of a year.
Oh,
So
wow. So that's quite different from your first
yeah, hello, are
I
you
said
there? Yeah,
that's quite different from your first experience with her.
totally. Because at that point there was not a lot of verbal instruction from her. She had kind of, I think she was slipping into some form of dementia, maybe, but her hands still had that quality, if not more so.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an astonishing experience doing that. There'd be three of us there typically, her, me, and her home health aide. And the home health aide, whenever Marge stood up, the home health aide would make sure she was standing behind her so she wouldn't
Yeah.
fall over.
That must have been so
It was
strange.
I have some pictures of that, of the three of us.
Hmm.
um, and it was astonishing. It was kind of like getting zapped um, for an hour and a half. I'd leave kind of floating out of the house, basically. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
so I mean, obviously that very end period was very different from
Extremely different. I mean,
but how, yeah,
yeah.
but how did you see from that first encounter at that workshop, winter workshop, did you see changes over the years? I mean, you mentioned when she got a very big group that it kind of sped up, but was there anything else that you kind of saw evolve or change?
I think it was mainly in her explanations to people. Typically after I've been coming a while, and I at some point I might be the person to drive her back home again at the end of the
Mm.
workshop. She would say to me, uh, she always called me Bob.
Hmm.
She would say, "Bob, I think that's the best workshop I've taught so far." Because she wasn't saying that as a boast or anything, but she was always working on how can she get these ideas across to people in the most effective way
Mm,
possible. And she would perfect, I'd say, around the edges, mainly in her explanation, how she used, what language she would use, how
mm,
she would how she would interact with students that had certain kinds of qualities or issues or whatever. She was a master of that. She was very
mm.
adaptable, very quick on her feet. Um, she, she pretty much any question anyone would ask her, she had she would have a response that would be just perfect for the questioner and perfect for the group. She was a master of verbal and nonverbal communication, I would say.
So, she obviously has influenced you a lot.
I would
um,
say so, yeah.
yeah. What would you say are the ways that comes out in the way that you teach, or the yeah? What are her biggest influences on you and your teaching?
Well, I think to answer that, it's important to understand where Marge lived, and her just general approach to life. You know, she grew up in the Midwest, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Um, kind of, she grew up in a time when it was not all that connected to the outer world. She wasn't, like most of the people who studied with Alexander in London were, more urban or
Hmm.
sophisticated people. She was not that kind of person. She was this extraordinarily practical, everyday, ordinary, practical kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
And she was always looking for better ways to do things or to do whatever it was she was doing. I think the huge advantage that she had after training with Alexander was being away from the UK scene, for almost exclusive, almost entirely in Lincoln. She did
Why
work.
why do you think that was a benefit to her?
Well, just to elaborate, she did work. She did work with A.R. Alexander for 2 or 3 years when he was in Boston, teaching in Boston and New
Okay.
York. So she was his assistant during that period, and she often said that, often extolled his teaching. She thought he was a brilliant teacher of the technique as
Mm-hmm.
well. I think the way being in Lincoln instead of being in London helped her. First of all, it took her out of all of the uh, petty feuds that existed among Alexander's main students, which
Yes.
were on full display when I first arrived there in the late 70s. They all seemed to hate each other, and they all seemed to have grudges going back, decades. Um, they disapproved of each other's teaching, and there were all these sort of petty. It was just a world of disputes, internal disputes, and
Hmm.
Marge was pretty much isolated from all of that. She was out in Lincoln, probably not doing a lot of teaching. She was certainly doing some, but she was, working on the ranch, and she was got into horseback riding big time, and she had a life that was pretty separate from all of that, and I think that allowed her to develop in a different kind of way. So I think and she just had a different sort of mindset than most Alexander teachers. It's hard to explain. She was very open to new ideas. Someone would suggest something new. She might mull it over for a little bit, and then she'd say, "Well, let's just try it and see what happens. Or one of her
Mhm.
favorite phrases was, well, I thought I would just give that a gambling chance.
Mhm. Mhm.
She was very open. That's how she got into teaching groups. She got a request in the early 70s when she was in her mid 70s
Mhm.
to teach a large group of people at a university in Texas. And she writes about this in one of the few bits of writing that we have from her. She said, "Well, I I had never taught those kind of groups before, a group like that before, but I thought I would just go down and see what I could do." And she said, on the bus ride down, that's what I was thinking about the whole time. What am I going to do? And it turned out to be not only a success, but the beginnings of groups of people coming to Lincoln every summer to work with her.
Mhm.
And that attitude of hers, interestingly enough, is almost exactly the same thing that F. Matthias Alexander writes about. It's in articles and letters somewhere.
Mhm.
He says, well, and he's living in Melbourne at the time, it's 1895, and he said a clergyman who was director of some kind of sort of religious college kind of place asked Alexander if he could teach a group of his students. And Alexander said, I told him I've never done that before, but if you're willing to take a chance, so am I. Something like that.
Mhm.
And then he describes a little bit about what he did, and at the end he said, "And I'm glad I did it. I don't think it was the kind of thing he wanted to do a lot of in general. I think he was happier with individuals or smaller groups. I think it was a group of 20 people, but it was almost identical to what Marge said, different
Mm.
words, but the same attitude. Oh,
Sure.
here's
Mhm.
something new. Let's see what happens. And that was very much her attitude, I think, towards life in general and towards teaching the Alexander technique.
So, what do you think her legacy to the Alexander community is?
Hmm.
Or how would you describe it? Or does she have one?
Oh, I
I'm
think she
pretty sure she
does.
does,
She
but yeah.
does, yeah. Well, I think certainly she showed. I mean, she wasn't the inventor of group work, and there were some early experiments in group teaching when I was in England. They were frowned upon by some teachers, but it was a very controversial topic back in the mid late 70s, early 80s. I think Marge figured out a way of working with groups and individuals at the same time that um, is kind of a model that some of her students still use to this day. I sometimes use pretty much her exact model if I'm working with a new group.
Well, it struck me actually as you described that first workshop and there's people sitting in a circle and her going around, and I've been in you introducing how your approach to group teaching, you've kind of done the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, her her ability to utilize her working with an individual in the group setting
Hmm.
to make that be of benefit to everyone else in the group.
Hmm.
Um, that was a new thing for me. I had never encountered that before, and along with it, kind of a part of that is emphasis on observation,
Mm.
observing how to observe yourself and how to observe others. She felt that was the kind of a basic key to everything. How can you actually notice what's going on in you and what's going on with people around you? And typically, when she would work with somebody, maybe, let's say they wanted to work with walking, and so she would give them a little help and maybe give them a little verbal instruction, and then they would walk, and it would be a different way of it. It would be a
Hmm.
better, easier quality. She might ask the person, well, what did you notice? Or she might ask the group, well, what did anyone see? She used the word notice a lot.
Hmm.
And I've thought about that word a lot. It's like the perfect word because it doesn't have a lot of oomph to it. It's sort of a very neutral word, right?
Hmm.
It it
Yeah, I
it's
like that word
it's a
too.
it's
Yeah.
it's it's a word that it definitely says something, but it doesn't say anything in a pushy way. And I
Hmm.
think I think that uh, developing the ability to notice stuff, changes in you and in others, is something that she really emphasized. And I don't remember seeing that emphasized all that much in my experience in England
Hmm.
with quite a variety of teachers. So
Well,
that
it
yeah,
wouldn't be needed in the same way one on one.
it wouldn't be needed in the way the technique was often taught with just
Hmm.
one teacher and one student. And uh, I mean,
Although it's still really useful, I would think. But
well, yeah, right.
uh,
It definitely. I remember once when Marge was giving a workshop in London in the late 80s, and she had some people up on stage, some teachers, and one teacher was working with another, and Marge was watching. And at some point, and this teacher, no words were being exchanged, and Marge said, "Don't you ever talk to your students?" But, she just wasn't into. Well, of course, at the end, when she was very old, that she just zapped you with her hands in those one-on-one sessions. But when she still had her cognitive facilities available, it was any lesson you had with her in a group, or even if you just came over to her house and had a little private session, it was always very interactive. She wanted
Mhm.
to know what was going on in your head. She didn't want
Right.
to just give you this nice hands-on experience on its own. She wanted you to be able to use it in the future.
Hmm.
So that's
Right.
certainly a legacy. What else? I don't know. I'm
Well,
trying to think what other legacies. I think the down to earthness of her presentation
well,
was something that I think a lot of teachers could learn from. When we would have these classes, people would show up, and they were the most unlikely people. Um, we'd have corn farmer from western Nebraska show up because he had a relative and Marge would just approach him just like, well, maybe I can give you a little help. I mean, she didn't make any big deal of it.
hmm
She would approach people exactly where they were, and she was very adaptable to the whoever she was working with. If she was working with someone, I can remember one incident. It was on one of her winter workshops when this guy, a student at the university, showed up, and he was a young guy. He was like 18 or 19. He was very very physically fit, strong, and very very tall. And he'd come, I think it was like his second or third day. He had just sort of dropped in, and after the third day, Marge would always say, "Did anyone have any questions?" And he raised his hand and said, "This is my third day. How come I haven't totally got it yet?" And there was this long pause, and we could see that my little wheels were turning in her head. And Marge, who's very short and slender, was standing right, moved right up practically, a foot away from him and up at him and
Hmm.
said, I don't think your body could take it. And everyone just burst out in laughter. She just had that ability to adapt to whatever came along. So there's that. And I guess another thing, and this gets into Alexander jargon, the term inhibition,
Mm.
which we all know about. Marge had a very different idea about inhibition than I think most teachers had. I remember going to a lecture in London uh, by Marjorie Barlow,
Hmm.
Alexander's niece, who was a very smart, articulate teacher. And she talked about inhibition, and she said it's kind of like a gear shift on a car. If you want to go, and this is standard
Sure.
transmission, most people don't even know what that is anymore. But if you
They
want
do in the
to,
UK.
in the UK, yeah, if you want to go from drive into first gear into reverse,
Second.
you got
Hmm.
to go through neutral first, right? There has to be this little stop first before you make the transition. And she likened that to inhibition. It's a little pause. A lot of teachers will talk in terms
Hmm.
of a little pause. And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's a really nice definition. I like that. But Marge would not have really bought into that. Marge was more, um, when she was once asked at a workshop, Marge, how come you never talk about inhibition? Because she never used the phrase.
Hmm.
And again, the long pause, how to answer this in the best way for everybody. She said, "Well, that's all I ever talk about." And by that, she meant, I believe, that she even said, if inhibition means not doing the thing you don't want to do, and if you do something else, then that's inhibition. So if you
Hmm.
don't want to pull down, maybe if you were to move up, you would be inhibiting the pulling
Hmm.
down. It was a more dynamic version of
Yeah.
inhibition. It was more like,
I
yeah,
personally can see that it could exist in both definitions.
sure. Well, I
I don't
think
think they're mutually exclusive, so
no,
yeah.
I agree. I mean, I like the analogy of, let's say you're driving down a two-lane highway and you realize you're going in the wrong direction.
Yeah, you do that,
You have to
yes.
change direction. Now, they're the sort of first thing you're probably going to have to do is pull off on the shoulder.
Mhm.
And then, depending if there's no other cars anywhere around, you could just go right into a U-turn. You wouldn't have
Mhm.
to stop. You would just turn around and go the other way. On the other hand, if there were some cars coming, you might actually stop for a bit. And
Exactly.
so it depended on,
On the situation,
or as
yeah.
Alexander teachers like to say, conditions present.
Hmm.
Sometimes maybe it really is going to be helpful to come to a full stop and redirect. But
Hmm.
she didn't, I think her approach was, if that's the case, that's the case. But
Hmm.
it doesn't have to be that way. It could just be a change in a changing direction, changing your energy flow. She sometimes used that
Hmm.
not that exact expression, but she would talk in terms of redirecting your energies.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
Interesting. Um, well, I mean, is there anything else that you want to say about her, or any kind of fond memories or anecdotes that you would like to share, or
she liked to
and
party. She was,
yeah.
that first those workshops. The first workshop, I think we started at 8 in the morning and went till 12, and then maybe 3 hours in the afternoon. And by the
Wow.
end of the day, we were pretty. I remember. going back to where I was staying and just flopping on the bed, going to sleep for a while. I mean, it was kind of exhausting.
Mhm.
But Marge, she was wanting to know who was up for going out to see a play, or anytime any group of people were doing anything, she wanted in on it.
Mm.
And she was there, ready to go. She wanted, if it was going to her favorite steakhouse, then she was definitely there.
Mhm.
Um, she was like very, yeah. I,
So it sounds like she was very well known and well liked in the local community.
Although not everybody in the local community understood why all these people were showing up at her
I
house or
can
at
imagine.
her workshop. I remember a story I heard from one of her other students who was a pilot, and he had a little Cessna plane. He flew her out to some little airstrip outside of Lincoln. There were a bunch of people standing around, and um, uh, he someone I forget how it came up. Someone knew Marge and said hello to her, and this guy said, "Oh, and there are a whole group of people here in Lincoln to study with her," and this guy said, "Study what?" Yeah, I mean, it just seemed like you know he he and she apparently said she was a little taken aback by that, and she thought a little bit, and then she said, well, I have a doctorate degree from this local university. It was an honorary degree, but she
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
wanted to get that in. But she was easily mistook for just a little old lady. It was very easy to mistake her. I'd go shopping with her, which was always an interesting trip, going shopping with her, because we went to this grocery store that doesn't exist anymore,
Hmm.
Ideal Grocery, where everyone knew her, and we were she was choosing onions, and she didn't just take an onion. I mean, she would examine the onion in minute detail before selecting it. So I was at there, and I was just sort of standing off to one side while she was choosing the appropriate
Hmm.
onions. And some lady came up to me and said, "Is that your grandmother?" I said, "No, my teacher." And well, really, your teacher? People would just they a lot of people had no idea what she was about in
Yeah.
Lincoln. Even
Well,
people who knew her from
well, I can
various.
imagine just from my own experience of being an Alexander Technique teacher. But yeah,
Yeah, and you're in
yeah.
a somewhat more sophisticated environment than
Oh
Lincoln was at
yes.
that time, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, there was this ordinariness about her that infused her teaching in a very good way, I think. She was not one to use jargon. But she was very focused on getting these ideas across. She wasn't going to compromise ever with that. Um,
Yeah, it occurs to me from all the things that you were mentioning that kind of could be considered part of her legacy. Um, and I don't think you mentioned this specifically in that context, but the kind of activity and application work she did
yes,
was
yes,
different from the what I think of a more the traditional approach
right. And
to the.
interestingly enough, when I first met her back in '79, I guess, the one activity she would not help people with was getting in and out of a chair.
Huh.
And I asked her, I said, well, hi, Marge, that's just another activity. And she said, oh, Bob, everyone's got all of these strange things they do. It's just one I'd like to stay away from. And I came to a point where I actually could sense that when I stood up or sat down, it wasn't just standing up or sitting down. I had all this Alexander overlay to it. So she just wouldn't do it. But then over time she relented. But the what she would then do, I remember the moment when someone said, "Oh, Marge, could you help me stand up?" And I was expecting her to say no, but she said, "Sure." And this guy was sitting with his legs, his feet way away from the chair,
Hmm.
and he was about to put him closer to get ready to have her help him, and she said, "No, leave your feet there." And what she wanted to do was just work with him on what do you do if you're in that situation, way
Hmm.
back in the chair, your feet way out in front, and you want to get onto your feet. And of course,
And
if you're really directing, then the feet will come in as needed, right? It's not. She didn't want to make it this like you had to sit in a perfect way to then have a chair to stand lesson. It was,
that's really interesting.
yeah.
I'm remembering that photograph. Was it the first Congress where they had all the teachers, the first generation teachers sitting on, well, all, but a lot of them sitting on stage, and
Yes.
she
Uh-huh.
was, because there's definitely was a look to all of them, including Marjorie Barstow, of sitting in a way that you wouldn't have really seen a bunch of other people sitting.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
They didn't have the legs crossed. They didn't, so.
Right. Well, there was at that time, after Marge had become better known, there was this um, idea that people who studied with Marge would look at other Alexander teachers and notice their stiffness, relative stiffness, and would refer to them as Alexandroids. And teachers from more traditionally trained teachers would look at Marge teachers and say, "Oh, they're slumping," or they're sloppy, they're slumping, and there was that kind of a difference. I remember one of the things she would often do when she was working with someone, she would ask them to deliberately go into a slump
Mm.
in order to help them out of that and show them that maybe they didn't have to do as much to get out of it as they thought. And I remember once working with a traditional teacher and saying, "Well, why don't you just go into a little slump?" And they said, "Why would I ever want to do that?" Like it was like the worst possible thing. And Marge, even herself, she would sometimes stand in front of the group and she talk when we were talking about slumping, and she'd say, "Sometimes I just feel like a good old slump." And then she would illustrate. Now, I got to say, it was a subtle slump,
Would
but
someone who wasn't an Alexander teacher even recognize it as
I
a
don't
slump?
know. It was pretty subtle, but she would drop down. She would let herself compress a little, and she'd say, and then maybe after a half a minute or so, I might think, well, I don't need to stay here anymore, and I'll just ease out of it. But she didn't have this thing about how you should never slump or something was
Right.
awful. It was more that slumping was something that might be getting in your way, and maybe you could learn how to ease out of it. But it wasn't like some sin. You're never going to slump again. You want to make sure you don't ever slump. It was more, oh, maybe that's not where you want to stay, kind of thing. It was just a different approach to a view of, I guess you could say, a view of use, to
Right.
use an Alexander term.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So anything else you would just like to share about her before we finish this up?
Well, I want to make a little plug for the website,
Mhm.
her marjoriebarstow.com, which has lots of stuff, lots of videos. There's a surprising amount of video available of her work. There are also lots of audio interviews from other teachers who've worked with her that I've interviewed that talk about other teachers' experiences with her and what they think of her legacy as being. So there's a lot of material there you can to learn about Marge's teaching. And I do think it's kind of interesting, I have to say, that none of the other major teachers have that kind of website devoted to them. And I wonder why, because surely there's some McDonald teachers who are web savvy and could come up with something, or, you know,
Or
Marjorie.
maybe you're putting a challenge out there
Well, I'm
to.
not putting. I mean, I think it's a little shocking that aren't other websites devoted to
To like the
this
Carringtons and McDonald
Donald's
and
and Marjorie Barlow and
Barlow, the
Dr.
Barlows.
Barlow, and they just don't have that available. And there's a fair amount of video of McDonald teaching, for example. He's written a fair amount. There could be someone who was a McDonald teacher could easily create a nice website for him, but no one has, and I don't know what that means. Um, just it's an interesting little factoid I just throw out there.
Okay. All
Maybe a
right. Well, this is
challenge. Maybe a
yes.
challenge.
So this has been absolutely fascinating, Robert. Thank you
Oh
for
well, thank
inviting me
you.
to talk about this with you.
Sure.
And so I'll just hand back to you to
Sure.
finish off for us
Well,
today.
thank you, Imogen. And just Imogen is, as I said before, an Alexander teacher in Wilmington, Delaware, and a website designer. I'll put a link to her page there. I'll put a link to Marjorie Barstow's page. I'll put a link to a page that will tell you more about the Alexander technique, and if you want to find a teacher of it, how to find one in your area. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you.